All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated.
Mr. Lukic, I hope that matters could be resolved during the break.
We checked the video, and actually there is no transcript for this part in evidence, so that's why it's not provided.
But then we should switch off the sound because if there's no transcript, we cannot rely on any text. And under those circumstances, I think that to present a text which is unknown to us in a public hearing is not the appropriate way to do it. So we could look at it. You could. I don't have any recollection about the emission of this document, but then we should switch off the sound and ignore, as we have done before sometimes, ignore words spoken.
We'll play 2 more videos, and there is no text in them either. So we'll just see the video, and if it's possible for technicians, they can turn off audio from them. I don't know, we cannot do it from our station.
Okay, could we check whether it's possible to have the sound switched off and that we only look at the pictures? Yes, that's possible. Then 1 second, please. Mr. Lukic, I was even informed that you can do it on your computer, so perhaps, but no problem. It will be switched off anyhow. But we'll then just continue. Then we have seen what we ought to see. We are not going to play that again, and we are now looking at video D917.
917, yes.
Yes, please proceed.
May I ask you, Mr. Lukic, because it was the standard procedure to have a transcript and the translation. Are these portions you are showing really in evidence? Are you certain about it?
Yes, they are. Yes,
Okay.
I'm certain about it, but there is no transcript for that part.
Thank you for this confirmation.
And we'll have a look at under what circumstances they were admitted. Let's proceed.
Thank you, Your Honors. We'll play a next video from 12 minutes, 21 seconds to 13 minutes. Can you slide, please? This video shows Ali Izetbegović touring Mujahedin unit. Thank you. And then can we see the next video? We have members of the same Bosnian Muslim forces killing Serbs, decapitating them. And then, next slide, we have members from the same video. We have members of Bosnian Muslim forces standing with their boots on the decapitating Serb heads. Just as Vox magazine.
Mr. Lukic, what is it in my e-court system that I have transcripts, which you apparently have not?
I do have a transcript, but not for this portion of video. We have transcripts, but not for the portion we played. We tried through the time,
Okay.
timestamps.
And you said you were playing from...
For example, the first one, if you check 10
Yes.
minutes 42, 11:02, there is just stars.
I have at least, well, let me see. It's a bit unclear. It's also a bit unclear now to what extent why we have an incomplete transcript, whether we have not played the whole of it before. Let's not spend too much time on it now.
We can translate that as well, but we didn't have time over the break. We would gladly translate that couple of sentences, Your Honors.
Okay, let's move on at this
Thank you.
very moment.
So just as Vox magazine threatened they would do in 1991, these pictures show us. Let there be no doubt that Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and even non-Serbs who did not go along with the SDA regime, had to defend themselves for their very survival. And let's not forget that the Bosnian Muslims and Croats had threatened the survival already in World War II, the survival of Serbs, as part of the Nazi forces that terrorized and killed Serbs, Jews, and Romas in Jasenovac and other death camps. That is not to say, of course, that all Muslims were Mujahideen or that all Croats were Ustasha. Can we see the next slide, please? And let's not forget the context that Ali Izetbegović and the leading Bosnian Muslim cleric, Rais Efendija Mustafa Cerić, met to discuss how it would be beneficial for the goal of obtaining foreign intervention if a massacre were staged in Markale and also in enclaves, with the aim that their own Muslim civilian population be sacrificed for the greater cause as Muslim martyrs. We have that evidence from the witness on transcript page 42688 and onwards. This is the same Ali Izetbegović who used the civilian population of Sarajevo as human shields, refusing to let them leave Sarajevo. We have it in P 6761, page 3, D 626, paragraph 63, D 597, paragraph 13, D 646, number 19, D 597, paragraph 13. And placing ABNH troops in civilian buildings and surrounded by civilians from which to shoot at the Serbs. D 1661, paragraph 142. Transcript page 25001. Transcript page 25107. D 613. D 509, paragraph 13. D 653, paragraph 38. Transcript page 767, Harland. D 535, paragraph 20. In the modern day, ISIS follows a similar model and acts very comparably to the words and deeds of Ali Izetbegović and his forces. And the whole world is aligned against ISIS and still is having difficulty to stop the terror. In 1992, when Ratko Mladić came to the VRS in May, All he had to stand against the terror of Ali Izetbegovic Mujahideen forces was a ragtag army, pulled together from remnants of various JNA units, TO units, mobilized civilian volunteers, with not enough professional officers to effectively command and control the same. Let's remember that the main staff of the VRS, rather than having hundreds and thousands of officers like the JNA 2nd Military District, had just around a dozen when it started its work. But it is clear that rather than acting from some criminal purpose, the VRS and General Mladić were driven by the legitimate aim to militarily defend against these threats and attacks from a very numerous army, an enemy who was armed and not adverse to using terror both against others and their own people to obtain the Muslim-dominated state that they had set out to obtain, as promised in the Izetbegovic Islamic Declaration. Next slide, please. And let's not forget that the prosecution narrative ignores the words and orders of General Mladić that urge for the non-Serb civilian population to be protected and for POWs to be treated properly and in accordance with the law. Here we have words from Directive 1. It's P474. The same words we can find in D726, D961, page 1, number 1, D711, paragraph 18. Everything good and innocent that General Mladić ever uttered or signed is ignored by the prosecution. Or, in their final brief, it is said to be a lie, because secret, unknown, and undocumented alleged meetings decided another faith, as in Srebrenica, where they cannot even identify what that secret criminal meeting would have taken place, except that it must have taken place in the few hours between two other meetings at Fontana Hotel, where the evidence is that nothing improper was discussed. The prosecution have used innuendo and impermissible inferences to say that when you have two possibilities available under the evidence, you must accept the one indicative of General Mladić's guilt, because he's General Mladić. And that is not the law. That is actually counter the law. They want you to ignore all the evidence that Ratko Mladić was constantly seeking a cessation of hostilities and asking for the UNPROFOR to enforce compliance by the Bosnian Muslim side to agreements, which they did not. Ratko Mladić neither started nor prolonged the war, and that we have in our evidence. Can we have another slide, please? Let's not forget that as the prosecution keep talking about separation being a central part of the Serb strategic objectives and thus the alleged criminal plan and enterprise. However, if we look at the context, we see that separation was what all three ethnic parties had been negotiating with international mediators for a long time, and which had been agreed to by all three sides as a way to peacefully resolve the situation and avoid the war. And that was the Bosnian Muslim side that sabotaged these peace negotiations by going back and renouncing its signature. Again, it is Alija Izetbegović doing this, per advice from the Americans, Ambassador Zimmerman specifically. We have it P6665 is a map from Ambassador Cutiliero, and we have P7772, also a map of the Cutiliero plan from March 1992. In front of us on our screens is D1403, its letter to Jose Cutiliero from Karadzic, Koljevic, and Krajišnik from March the 2nd, 1992, informing him that Izetbegović refused the plan and that at the same time and the same day, in the wedding parade in Sarajevo, a Serbian bridegroom's father was killed by a Muslim. If separation is the first step in the Serbs' criminal plan, then is that also to say Ambassadors Cutiliero, Akashi, Hurd, Oven, Stoltenberg were the architects of that plan? How about other members of the international community who tried to achieve peace by way of separation? What about UNPROFOR peacekeepers trying to separate the warring parties? Are they part of the JCE, Joint Criminal Enterprise? No, they are not. Why? Because we return to the prosecution's central theme. It is okay if someone else does or promotes something, like separation. But if you do the same thing and you are an ethnic Serb, a member of the Bosnian Serb government, police, military, or local Bosnian Serb, then you are automatically guilty. You are then automatically a liar if you say something else then that is indicative of following the law. You are damned with guilt that you cannot wash off yourself, because that guilt is made to define you by ethnicity and membership in a legitimate military organ, rather than by your acts or deeds. Vox magazine, if it were operating today, would probably react to the prosecutor's absurd assumptions by proclaiming, "Welcome to the Fourth Reich." There is much more context that the prosecution narrative chooses to ignore, but for which there cannot be any question that Ratko Mladić is not responsible for those things, and yet they happened. And they had a profound effect on people and events in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That those uncontrollable contextual matters riled up people's emotions and tensions, and that they created a threat and a powder keg all over Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that subsequent efforts to try and deal with the same cannot thus be viewed in a vacuum, but they must be viewed in a context and understood according to the context. Can we have another slide? Thank you. Ratko Mladić is not a monster. He was a soldier defending against a monster. That monster being the Islamic war machine and terror let loose by Alija Izetbegović and his calls for jihad. And eventually that Islamic war machine was supported by outside help, per the prosecution's own expert, General Richard Dannett, the US Pentagon coordinated NATO airstrikes to coincide with Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat military attacks to defeat Serbs. And we have it, a transcript page 19188, line 19 to 19194, line 8. That is why Ratko Mladić is here today. Because he's a Serb and dared stand up against Alija Izetbegović's jihad, which was covertly backed by the forces of NATO. Now I want to shift gears to give you a brief overview of what we will be presenting as our case theory before I hand over to Mr. Ivetić. And I will try to be brief, and those things will be developed later. The defense does not deny that unfortunate and opportunistic crimes occurred, but those in no way can be connected to General Ratko Mladić. And in any event, not every crime alleged by the prosecution actually occurred as a crime in the manner alleged. This case still has the prosecution seeking to hold Ratko Mladić guilty for events that have been proven under the evidence to have been the acts of the other side, Alija Izetbegović's forces, including various shellings in Sarajevo, like Širokača, Markale, etc. This case still has the prosecution seeking to hold Ratko Mladić guilty for destruction of cultural and religious buildings based on adjudicated facts and scant witness testimony, when the prosecution's own expert, Riedlmayer, has confirmed that some of these mosques did not exist or were damaged or destroyed before the war. It is all an insult to the criminal justice system to be bringing charges like this. Ratko Mladić arrived as VRS commander of the main staff on the 12th of May 1992. Predating that were many contextual events that gave rise to a legitimate fear, a legitimate threat from armed Bosnian Muslim military forces sponsored by the SDA that caused a war situation to develop and explode, in which Ratko Mladić had no role. Many events in the municipalities, even crimes, occurred and were pursued by others before Ratko Mladić came to the VRS, and without any involvement of him, yet this prosecution wants to hold him responsible. As to the interactions with others, the prosecution has improperly recast these as illegal and secret criminal conspiracies where Mladić agreed to the JCE. But another interpretation is more logical available, because these are really legitimate meetings of state organs to discuss self-defense and difficult and complex situations caused by the war. The prosecution, by attempting to define as a JCE member every Bosnian Serb civilian, police and military member, has attempted to thus redefine every legitimate meeting as criminal meeting. That is not appropriate. At those meetings, Ratko Mladić would speak in support of moderation and efforts for all persons of the Republika Srpska to live peacefully, irrespective of ethnicity. The prosecution would try to hold General Mladić responsible for the actions undertaken by other structures, such as police, crisis staffs, and other government organs, over which he had no authority and of whose actions he would not be informed. At the VRS, Ratko Mladić, when he arrived, had drastic shortages of personnel, shortages of professional officers and junior officers, and had to deal with conflicting interests and conflicting notions of how to wage a war. He, along with all other VRS officers, were excluded from the Supreme Defense Command or Council. That made binding decisions for the RS. Further, civilian leaders declined to declare a state of war, which further limited the powers of the army and General Mladić and his military commanders to act like an army despite the war conditions. Facing manpower shortages, sanctions, and an enemy that outnumbered him, General Mladić was further limited in terms of his abilities to effectively wage a defensive war. He did his best, trying to instill discipline, honor, and courage in his soldiers. It is instructive that not a single prosecution witness who was a former officer of the VRS had anything negative to say about General Mladić and did not implicate him in any illegal orders. Not a single one. Even Momir Nikolić's evidence can only claim that General Mladić gave a dismissive hand gesture, not that he ordered any criminal killings. Surely, if General Mladić were guilty of leading a criminal campaign, at least one insider witness would have something bad to say about him as a military officer. That is the man before you today as an accused. In the municipalities, the prosecution sees separation of peoples and a military campaign directed against civilians to drive out or destroy all non-Serbs. But there is a more logical alternative under the evidence. Namely, the efforts in line with the Kutilero plan that were undertaken together by Muslims and Serb leaders in the municipalities to split the police and split the municipality, which were intended to prevent, not foster war. Unfortunately, the Bosnian Muslims abandoned their efforts for peace and instead initiated attacks in municipalities and refused to disarm after same. The presence of armed Bosnian Muslim forces that did not disarm created a security risk, especially with further attacks initiated by them. These attacks and the threat of an escalated combat situation with continued fighting led many persons, both Serb and non-Serb alike, to leave the area, to seek more security. The lack of jobs, resources, utilities, and food likewise made persons leave. Still, others left because of orders by the SDA party or ABH to leave an area so they could attack it or to go to another area to mobilize and strengthen ABH forces. Persons also left when legitimate combat was undertaken to disarm these Bosnian Muslim military units and clear areas of hostile forces. Military actions were aimed at armed hostile forces and meant to separate these forces from the territory to neutralize their threat. None of this leads to the conclusion that General Mladić is criminally responsible for departures of the population or for legitimate military actions against hostile opposing forces. That military actions were tied to legitimate military purpose and not genocide against non-Serbs is best illustrated by the fact that non-Serbs who disarmed and were not hostile stayed in municipalities and not often were protected by the very VRS. Non-Serb personnel served in the VRS and were sought to be mobilized into VRS. Where other actions, including crimes, were undertaken by renegade individual VRS personnel of their own accord or non-VRS organs, such as police or paramilitaries, such actions were not under the authority of General Mladić, and he cannot be criminally responsible for the same. There is no linkage between the actions and General Mladić. In the chaos of war, in the municipalities, various detention facilities were set up. But most of them were operated by non-VRS organs, and the accused had no role in their operation or function, and thus could not affect conditions. Incidents, like the so-called Room 3 massacre at Karatar, were reported as legitimate casualties from an attempted escape by the police, and thus could not be known to the accused as otherwise. As to VRS-run facilities, there were only two, Mladić and Batković. As to each, the VRS orders from General Mladić were to treat the POWs in accord with law. Shortages in resources and supplies made it difficult to meet dietary and other requirements 100%, and the VRS asked for assistance from humanitarian aid agencies. Prisoners were registered with ICRC, and known crimes against them were punished and sought to be prevented. The VRS and General Mladić had a policy of seeking always to exchange prisoners with the other side, and worked with various humanitarian organizations to make that happen. None of this leads to the conclusion that General Mladić is criminally responsible for treatment in detention facilities. Again, there is no linkage with General Mladić. As to Sarajevo, contrary to the prosecution's false image of the SRK as aggressor against an undefined and vulnerable city of civilians, the evidence supports the alternative conclusion that legitimate and proportionate military actions were taken against a defended city that had a significant number of ABH troops interspersed with civilians. The SRK was essentially an army of local residents, inexperienced in combat, who were cobbled together by necessity and held as one by the small number of professional officers in their midst, and the desire to protect their homes and their families from what they perceived as a rising tide of Muslim fanatism and hostility unleashed by Ali Izetbegović. The SRK and VRS had little desire to take Sarajevo. Their objectives were simpler than that. They wanted to feel that they would be safe in a territory they valued the rights of, all peoples equally, in which they were free from the threat of subjugation. Their war was one of self-defense. That is how General Mladić understood the situation around Sarajevo. And that is how General Mladić intended to lead the VRS around Sarajevo, in a war of self-defense. In the context of Sarajevo, it is important to note that the legitimate combat ensued in and around Sarajevo between 92 and 95 was not meant to terrorize. The Serb political leaders and General Mladić negotiated ceasefires and held diplomatic talks for the resolution of the conflict. But those on the ground felt little relief. Ceasefires were constantly violated by Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, who also ignored weapon exclusion zones and did not demilitarize Sarajevo. Weapons were illicitly shipped in through humanitarian convoys for the ABH. The SRK were attacked by ABNH mobile mortars that evaded their defensive return fire. They were harassed by ABNH artillery positions in civilian areas, sniped at from high-raised buildings, and despite their mounting frustrations and the death of civilians located within the territory they were trying to protect, they were constantly told by their superiors to hold fire unless absolutely necessary. It became a question of how much they could tolerate before it became absolutely imperative to return fire. The Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina fired in provocation and to inflict damage to the SRK from amongst Sarajevo's residential neighborhoods and from their hiding places in residential tower blocks and the grounds of the local hospitals, knowing that this limited the ability of the SRK to return fire and defend themselves, and could be used to further fuel propaganda efforts of the ABNH to portray Serbs as ruthless villains. It was a constant balancing act for the SRK to determine exactly what force was required to halt these attacks and how much was too much and would unduly impact on the local civilian population in which the Army of BNH had hidden themselves. The VRS and General Mladić constantly appealed to the UN to act according to its mandate and take action against Army of BNH, violations of ceasefire and violations of the rules of war, but to no avail. These frustrations were born out of the negotiating table and in meetings with internationals, driving many, including the accused, to make threats and adopt hardline positions they might otherwise have avoided, but always with the aim of trying to obtain a permanent cessation of hostilities, rather than to inflame the war. These frustrations only grew as the international community criticized and protested and punished the actions lawfully undertaken by the SRK, willfully ignoring the actions of the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, both lawfully undertaken or otherwise, including the deliberate sniping and shelling of their own people, for which they often imputed blame upon the SRK, knowing they could and would get away with it. It seemed too many at the same time, like a masterful piece of manipulation of the international community by the Bosnian leadership. The evidence now reveals that indeed Ali Izetbegović chose to sacrifice the lives of his own people in staged massacres, which he blamed upon the VRS for sympathy and to get outside intervention on his behalf. General Mladić cannot be criminally responsible for the same. The international community asserted and continues to try to assert that Sarajevo was proclaimed as a safe zone. This is quite frankly a joke. The Muslim side launched 28 major offensives on the Serb positions within Sarajevo, as well as countless small offensives, countless, every day. Sarajevo was definitely a defended city and not a demilitarized zone. As to Srebrenica, the demilitarization of that locale was violated and not adhered to by both the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina forces of Nasser Orić and the UN personnel, who turned a blind eye to the same. The presence and attacks of Orić's forces transformed Srebrenica into a defended city rather than a demilitarized zone. The VRS Krivaja 95 action was a legitimate military action against a hostile enemy force, as was ambush and combat with the column of Srebrenica military forces that tried to break through to Tuzla. There was no forcible transfer of the civilian population from Potocari. If the departures from Potocari were part of a criminal plan, then those that planned it would be guilty. In this case, it was the civilian and military leadership of the Srebrenica Muslims themselves who first declared to leave, and then it was the UN that ordered Colonel Karamans to ask General Mladić to permit and assist in the evacuation in order to prevent a humanitarian disaster. To hold General Mladić criminally liable for a humanitarian action ordered by the ABH and Bosnian Muslim civilian and ordered requested by Amprofor would be a gross perversion of a justice that would forever tarnish and blemish the reputation and legacy of this tribunal and threaten the very concept of international law and justice. As to the unfortunate killings that occurred in Srebrenica, the defense does not deny that some persons were killed in opportunistic and uncontrollable acts of private revenge by members of the MUP, by locals, and even by renegade members of the VRS security organs. These killings were not ordered by General Mladić and were not committed in direct violation of the express orders, and were committed in direct violation of the express orders of General Mladić, who was recorded at several instances and by multiple persons as having decreed that all POWs would be exchanged with the other side. The prosecution expert, Richard Butler, confirms that he has found no express orders from General Mladić for the killings. That is because General Mladić did not order them and was not present when they occurred. General Mladić cannot be criminally responsible for the same. Now, as to these killings, it must be understood that not all the deaths that are claimed by the prosecution are the result of killings that were criminal in nature. The prosecution does not care to differentiate between criminal deaths and those killed in a legitimate firefight after detainees at Kravica overpowered police guards and took their weapons, killing and wounding these guards, which precipitated the revenge killings. The prosecution, likewise, fails to acknowledge its own expert, Butler, its own body of witness statements taken by themselves, and the fact that Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina itself shows significant number of combat casualties of the column, which numbered up to 6,000, according to the Muslim side. Rather, it includes those deaths to boost the number of victims from the criminal killings. Further, the prosecution tried to ignore ABNH evidence and its own investigation that indicated persons exhumed from Srebrenica mass graves were casualties that had become deceased in the years prior to 1995 and thus could not be attributed as victims of crimes in 1995. Lastly, the prosecution relies on unreliable demographic combinatory tactics to get a targeted result to further boost their number of victims. When we say that, we mean Eva Tabo. It was revealed at trial that 70% of prosecution victims exhumed from Srebrenica mass graves were in fact registered soldiers of Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Given the lack of care taken to determine the truth, forensically and serious questions raised upon the prosecution's own forensic investigation into how they died included evidence that those leading the OTP and PHR exhumations compromised that work. William Hagland, by destroying clothes that could have told of the military status of a body, and Dr. Kirchner, by forcing pathologists to change cause of death in autopsies. It is impossible to determine with certainty how many of those persons were potentially killed in combat to the degree required to be reasonable doubt standard. This is especially true given that the other questions were raised about the forensic work and the reliability of these findings. General Mladić cannot be criminally responsible for the same either. As to the claim of hostages, the defense again must point out that under the full context of the factual evidence, it is clear that UN personnel were detained as POWs and combatants after the UN engaged NATO, and both came combatants in striking Serb positions, using UN personnel as the means to identify targets and direct the fighter jets to the same. The only orders of General Mladić were to treat these persons in accord with the laws as POWs. The evidence is not, for the most part, the evidence is that, for the most part, VRS commanders followed General Mladić's orders and kept those individuals in proper POW conditions. In a few isolated incidents, renegade persons and persons unknown and not acting pursuant to VRS orders took excessive measures with detained UN personnel. In all instances, the actions of General Mladić were to respond by ordering subordinates to secure these same men in VRS custody, and they were thereafter treated in accord with POW positions. Thus, General Mladić cannot be held responsible for the acts of persons not following his orders, but engaged in personal acts, especially when he undertook to remove those same UN personnel from harm's way and have them secured as POWs with protections afforded as flowing therefrom. Not one person was harmed, and moreover, everybody was released shortly after. As a further overview of what the defense has shown in detail in the final brief, and that we will in more detail today and the next days bring out in court, we must stress that the prosecution must rely on unbelievable and compromised evidence to try and attain its burden to convict General Mladić. They made a deal with the devil as to Srebrenica with Momir Nikolić, who tried to pass off his own role in crimes to General Mladić because he wanted to reduce his sentence and be released early. And he was rewarded for this by being released early. But the flaw in Nikolić's entire self-serving story is the concession that he never received any explicit orders to commit killings of Srebrenica POWs before he commenced to orchestrate the same. This means neither from General Mladić nor Colonel Blagojević, his superior. Nikolić is present everywhere and has blood up to his elbows. Blagojević and Mladić cannot be placed anywhere near the killings. General Mladić cannot be held criminally liable for the criminal acts of Momir Nikolić and those he conspired with to kill Srebrenica POWs in violation of General Mladić's orders and without his knowledge. The prosecution likewise turns to a body of purported radio relay communications intercepts that defy technology, common sense, and logic. On the one hand, the most important conversations always were preserved by recording them. On the other hand, none of the alleged important conversations alleged of General Mladić can be found to have been recorded. One of the main radio intercept operators, denounced by the head of the unit and by official ABH records as having not worked there until 1996, 1 full year after the alleged intercepts were heard and written down by him. Intercept records were not given to the OTP until many years later. Some in books bear indicia of a date of a publication after 1995, which defies logic. This questionable evidence cannot rise to the level necessary to convict anyone. The prosecution also relies on propaganda and other evidence without regard for the potential bias of that source, including international media and members of international organizations, such as UNPROFOR and UNMOS. That there was bias among some of the members of UNPROFOR and UNMOS has been demonstrated and confirmed by several former UN officers who have testified at this trial. Thus, no one, let alone Ratko Mladić, should be convicted based on evidence that comes from such sources prone to bias. Before I turn over these duties to my colleague Ivetić, let me just stress that as more and more evidence come in, it has become more and more clearer how much the prosecution has twisted and misrepresented facts. This defense was ready and sought to provide even more evidence and witnesses that we believe would have likewise shown that Ratko Mladić cannot be guilty of the things he is charged with, but we were prevented by this chamber from doing so. And we believe this was done unfairly, since we had not used up the time allocated to us. That error by this chamber can be rectified only with an acquittal. So I urge you to correct the mistake. Now Mr. Mladić will probably, after the break, continue with the remainder of our submissions. Thank you, Your Honors.
Thank you, Mr. Lukic. Just to have matters perfectly clear from a procedural point of view, as you may remind, there was a discussion about Mr. Mladić addressing the 98 bis hearing to address the court. I think at that point in time there was an issue as to whether he could address the court in the absence of counsel, but then in 98 bis it was established that Mr. Stojanovic, as co-counsel, was there. So under those circumstances, Mr. Mladić addressed the court, though not being counsel. I think we are in a similar position now that both lead counsel and co-counsel are present, so that but I'll just check that with you, Mr. Tiga. There's no problem in Mr. Mladić presenting this part of the final argument.
Our intent is only not to bother you, everybody, with my accent, so you'll listen to proper English.
Well, it's a very charming accent, Mr. Lukic. Then I think we'll first take a break, and we'll resume at 10 minutes to 12 o'clock.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.